And Ms. Ramsey, before you get started, I think maybe we could spin the microphone top a little bit towards the jury. See, I'm worried you're going to, I sat here on the edge of my seat that somebody's going to trip. Okay, when you're ready.
Okay. Good morning. This case is a case about fear. It is about people being afraid. And that is exactly what Charlie Vorpagel told you it was about. I believe they were afraid. Almost 3 weeks ago, when we started speaking to many of you in jury selection, there were some who voiced sort of an instinctual reaction to the ultimate inhumane action, and that is the purposeful killing of another human being. Many expressed thoughts that the reason for that killing wouldn't matter because 3 people are dead, and that was the thing that you needed to focus on. And that seems to be the import of the state's argument here. But when we talked to you 3 weeks ago, we talked about the law, and we talked about the fact that all of you agreed that you would follow that law. The law is not an excuse. It's not. But it is something that we all abide by as citizens. It is not enough to simply prove that Mr. Vasata was there. It is not enough to point to evidence and say he was there. It is not enough to say he was wearing a hoodie. It is not enough to say that his DNA is present. The government has told you in their opening argument that motive is not an essential element of the crime. We don't have to prove motive. And while this is legally correct, to convict Christopher Vasata of first-degree murder, the government is required to prove beyond any reasonable doubt held by any single juror that Christopher Vasata consciously decided to murder one or all 4 of those individuals. And that decision to do so, that conscious thought and determination to murder, was present in his mind on February 5th, 2017 at 10:30 in the evening. Had to be present. Now stop for a moment and think about what the import of that legal instruction from the court is. What does it really mean? What it means is that he had to consciously be thinking, with whatever action he took, I want Sean Henry dead. I want Charlie Vorpagel dead. I want Brandy Alsahi dead. I want Kelly Doherty dead. It is not enough to simply argue that because they had weapons, because they were present, that you can infer those things. Because that's what intent is. It is the conscious thought and determination of Mr. Vasata. To convict Christopher Vasata of second-degree murder, the government must convince every one of you that on February 5th, 2017 at 10:30 at night, that he knew whatever action he was engaged in was imminently dangerous, about to happen, going to happen, and that when he knew that fact, not only did he know the fact, but he held the fact in a point of his heart where there was evil, there was malice, there was hatred of these individuals. And that is why it is so critical that you consider what were Mr. Vasata's actions and what do the circumstances before this took place tell you about what possible motive there could be for this. Motive is critical in this fashion. So when Charles Vorpagel came into this courtroom and he took an oath, and he started talking to you about his relationships with different individuals, and one of them, of course, was Mr. Vasata. And when he talked about Mr. Vasata, he repeatedly used one word: friend. They were friends. He used the same word that he used when he talked about Sean Henry. They were friends. They had known each other for approximately the same time, all of them 5 to 6 years. They were all engaged in the same business. They were all feeding off of each other's businesses. There had never been a conflict between them. They had never had a fight. They had never shot guns at each other. They had never hurt each other. None of that had happened. They were friends. Now, Mr. Vorpagel, after this happens, comes in here and tells you, well, now I question that because I believe he was involved. But that's just speculation. You have to know that, right? Because for 5 to 6 years, on a weekly basis, they all saw each other, and they liked each other. They were friends. When you examine the phone records of Mr. Vasata, you see that there are many phone calls between him and between Mr. Vorpagel and between Sean Henry. And one of the things you'll notice is that, striking about it, is that there are only a handful of contacts that are actually named in the phone records. There's about 7. 2 of those are Charlie and Sean Henry, 2 of Mr. Vasata's longest friends. And there are phone calls that are exchanged between them throughout the weekend. And Charlie admits to you that there are text messages exchanged between them throughout the weekend. Luke Kasukis is not a contact in Mr. Vasata's phone, nor is Marcus Stewart. And there are lots of phone calls between them, but there are none that are answered by Mr. Vasata until the 5th, the day that this happens. Charlie Vorpagel tells you himself, he didn't even think that Christopher was a friend of Luke Kasukis. He had a great dislike for Luke Kasukis, and he tells you that he believed there was actually a conflict between Vasata and Kasukis. He believed that their business relationship had simply to do with Mr. Kasukis working off a debt to Mr. Vasata. He talked about knowing that Mr. Vasata had at one point repossessed a bike from Mr. Kasukis. But they all knew each other. Everybody knew each other. And one of the things that Mr. Vorpagel tells you is that Jupiter is a relatively small town. People knew each other. They knew these guys. They saw them around town. They saw them in bars. They saw them out and about. Mr. Vorpagel's assessment of Mr. Vasata's relationship with Luke Kasukis is uncontested by the state. The government has no evidence to suggest anything different about the relationships between these people. Sometimes what appears to be is really what is. And why is that important? It's important when you think about the fact that the government needs to prove to you that Mr. Vasata went there with the intention of murdering somebody. That's what's important. He didn't know those girls would be there. He didn't know that. There's no evidence to suggest he knew they would be there. He went there to see Sean and to see Mr. Vorpagel.
Objection, facts not in evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, just rely on your recollection, your notes, and its closing argument.
Before this incident happens, there are a series of events that happen with regard to Mr. Vorpagel that create some pressure for him. First, he tells you that he has 2 DUIs. One of them is here in West Palm, and the other is in Michigan. And he actually has to leave Jupiter, where he does business, and go to Michigan, and he's been there for more than 2 months. He readily admits to you that that was a tremendous strain on his finances. He wasn't able to work at that time, work being dealing drugs. He wasn't able to pay his rent. He was telling lies to his family in order to get them to pay his bills during that time. And when he comes back to Jupiter on January 14th of 2017, he admits that he is desperate to get back into the game. He needs to make money. He needs to get his customers back. And in fact, those customers have been serviced by somebody else for the last 2 months. He tells you that Lou Kasoukas is one of those individuals in Jupiter who is a well-known drug dealer. A lot of people thought he was a good drug dealer. He was dealing drugs in competition with Mr. Vorpagel. Mr. Vorpagel is having so much difficulty that he is doing things that we talked about during the cross-examination and during Detective Harrington's testimony. He's taking money from people, promising to send them packages of drugs, getting those drugs and reselling them to somebody else, and not servicing those particular customers that can't physically get to him. And he is concerned about his ability to get back into the game and make the kind of money that he made before. So in sort of a desperate effort, he decides to start a new business venture that would include an individual named Moss Cord, and forges an alliance with him. So now it will be him, Sean Henry, and Moss Cord engaging in this drug dealing. But it's still not enough. Because suddenly on Super Bowl weekend, that weekend of February 3rd, 4th, and 5th, Vorpagel decides to renew an old claim that is unsubstantiated, but will effectively eliminate the competition with Mr. Kasoukas. He starts saying again and telling everyone in the Jupiter area that he believes that Luke Kasoukas is responsible for a robbery or a burglary of another dealer in which $14,000 worth of product is taken. It's unclear whether or not that product belonged just to Mr. Keating, the guy who was robbed, or if it was part of Vorpagel's own stuff. Because can you believe him? I mean, do you believe Charlie Vorpagel? Do you believe anything he says? 4-time convicted felon who sat up here and said with a straight face, oh, I know it was Luke Kasoukas. Like, because there was surveillance video that you were passing around that had the Charger, the Dodge Charger that Mr. Kasoukas was driving, that's why you're so confident? And what does it turn out? Look at the text messages regarding that with him and Sean Henry. It wasn't the vehicle at all. Kasoukas was never mentioned in his text messages with Sean Henry, nor with his friend Kyle. And it's a completely different vehicle. At some point, you see Sean Henry having great reluctance and saying, hold up, we don't know who it was. We don't know it was them. You know, one of the saddest and most disturbing parts about this is that Mr. Vorpagel comes in here and he tells you, like he told detectives under oath, this was Sean's idea. You know? Sean was going to make sure it happened. Everybody knows Sean gets things done. He does. If Sean Henry were here on trial for a conspiracy to murder, would you convict based on Mr. Vorpagel's testimony? We don't know what Sean Henry was doing in terms of that. We only know what Mr. Vorpagel comes in here and tries to tell you now. It wasn't me. I mean, I thought it was a good idea. It was a good idea. It wasn't going to stop him, but it wasn't my idea. Just like the night that he was in the hospital and the cops were asking him about the guns and the drugs in his house. Oh, the cocaine? Mr. already brought that. The guns, they belong to my dad. He'll blame anybody in the world for what he's done. He does not take responsibility for anything. And he is not credible with most of the things that he talks about. One of the things that the state has talked about here today is they talked about, look at this assault rifle. There's only one reason to have an assault rifle. There's only one reason to have rifles, period, if you're not a hunter, to kill people. Have you ever seen an arsenal like you saw in Mr. Vorpagel's house? What did he have his assault rifle for? What did he have his Mossberg rifle for? What did he have his semi-automatic handguns for? What did he have smoke grenades for? Those are not guns that we have around for self-protection. Those are guns of destruction, and that's what he had. Whatever these individuals had when they came to Mr. Vorpagel's house on the 5th, it pales in comparison to what Mr. Vorpagel has. And they were afraid. Now, one of the things that the state says, the government says, is they say, Mr. Vorpagel told you it was Sean's idea, and Sean was the individual who actually had a conversation. He had a conversation with Mr. Vasata about taking out Luke Kasoukas. You know, he was going to take him out, and he asked Mr. Vasata if that was okay. And I believe that Mr. Vasata said it was okay, although I wasn't present for that. I wasn't part of that conspiracy. Can you believe him? There is not a scintilla of evidence that supports that. We don't know that. The government has not proven that to you. Do you know that Sean Henry talked to him about killing Mr. Kasoukas? We don't know. Do you know if Mr. Vasata agreed to that? Or if he said, hold up, Sean, hold up. You know that's not true. You know, look at the text messages where they're talking about posting the picture of the truck on Facebook with their 500 followers. And nobody was saying it was him. We don't know that that's true. We don't know. You don't know that there was some agreement between Mr. Vasata and Sean Henry, or if Mr. Vasata was playing them, like Mr. Vorpagel says. Do you know what you do know? Out of the mouth of Mr. Vorpagel himself, that he does a lot of drugs, and when he does a lot of drugs, he has really angry, violent impulses that he's been treated for in the past. That's what we know, and it's not something that is common to any other player in this case. So When Mr. Vasata talked to Sean Henry, it is just as likely that Vasata said, wait, this can't happen. It can't happen. I mean, do you know what will happen if we start shooting at each other in this small town? Okay, I know everybody. You know everybody. Do you know whether or not Sean Henry knew that Vasata was coming there that night to talk to Charlie? Do you? There's no evidence of that. None. The biggest hole in it is those phone calls that go back and forth between Charlie and Sean and Lou Kasoukas and Charlie and Sean and Lou Kasoukas. And when I asked Mr. Vorpagel what's going on in those phone calls, back to back, what's going on? What is Chris saying to you? What's he telling you? What is he asking? What is he negotiating? Oh, I don't remember anything Mr. Vasata said. Not one word. Can't remember a word he said. Don't know what was going on. Did Sean know? Did he know they were coming to talk? Why did he have a gun that night? Why? You know, Mr. Vorpagel said they didn't carry guns around the house. They didn't because they didn't need to. There was a gun in every room. There was a gun in reachable distance all the time. Why'd Sean Henry have a gun stuck in his back? Was he expecting them to come? Was he expecting there to be a conversation? Was he worried? Was he worried how it would go? That scenario is just as likely as the government scenario. Just as likely. You don't just turn around and decide that you're going to murder somebody that you have known since you were a teenager, that you have done business with since you were a teenager in a small town. You don't. The government stood up here and kept saying, well, Marcus Stewart, Christopher Vasata, and maybe there was a third person. Maybe there was a third. You know there was a third person. You know Lou Kasoukas was there. You know it. Hirsch told you, we credited the statements of Marcus Stewart to such an extent that we put it in a sworn affidavit and got a warrant based on that because he told us Luke Kasoukas was there. Luke Kasoukas was a shooter. He was there. He is the individual that had the greatest motivation for committing this crime. He did not have a friendship with Sean Henry. He did not have a friendship with Mr. Vorpagel. They didn't like each other. They were in competition. And Mr. Vorpagel was running around town making false accusations about Mr. Kasoukas robbing people of tens of thousands of dollars and telling people he was going to harm him. Luke Kasoukas had the greatest motivation for doing some harm. Mr. Vasata did not. And the government has given you no evidence of anything different. They have not charged Mr. Kasoukas in this case, and they have not charged him because they simply do not have enough evidence. But you know he was there. He told the police, I have an alibi, I was home. And you heard Detective Hirsch tell you that Mr. Kasoukas is seen going into his home at 6:38 in the evening with a friend. At 7:05, that friend leaves, and Mr. Kasoukas is never seen leaving again. There are 3 dark figures that are seen outside of Mr. Kasoukas' house at 7:20 in the evening. They cannot identify them. And they cannot identify whether Mr. Kasoukas is one of them. But he is never seen leaving otherwise. And the next day, he is seen coming home. He wasn't there. He wasn't at his home. He was at the shooting where he was motivated to be. Kasoukas is the individual who had that rifle. And you know that. The state wants to talk about DNA in this case, but Mr. Pribble is going to talk to you about that in more detail. But you know that every item in this case, from the Honda, from the scene, from Mr. Vasata himself at Passaic Way, has blood on it. It's all bloody. State's word, he was bleeding out. That's what happened. Mr. Kasoukas, at the time this happened, actually had a place, as Mr. Vorpagel told you, that was right around the corner on Delaware. He used to stay there sometimes. And he was certain of that because not only had he heard that from a lot of people, but his sister told him she'd actually seen Luke walking the dog there on Delaware, where the sister lived as well. When Mr. Vorpagel talks about the individuals leaving the house, he talks about seeing two individuals who remain behind in the driveway. And only one individual is helping a grievously injured Christopher Vasata, Marcus Stewart, because his DNA is mixed on the items that are found on I-95, not Mr. Kasoukas. And Mr. Kasoukas simply leaves. Now, the state stood up here and they told you Chris Vasata was accidentally shot. There's no evidence of that. You know that? Mr. Vasata was shot, as they have told you, with a high-powered rifle, exactly the same as all three of those individuals who were there at Mohawk Street. And he was shot in the back, twice. Twice. You don't know it was accidental. We don't know what the relationship was between Mr. Kasoukas and Mr. Vasata when Mr. Vasata was trying to negotiate some type of détente to the conflict that was going on. It's all speculation. It's all speculation. And the government's theory about this is as speculative as anything that you will hear. They have evidence that Christopher Vasata was present at Mohawk Street. They have evidence that Christopher Vasata was shot in the back twice, nearly died. They have evidence that one person, Marcus Stewart, helped Mr. Vasata out of that scene and saved his life. They have evidence that Mr. Kasoukas was there in testimony and in motivation, but they have not charged him. They have evidence of all of these things, just as they have evidence that Mr. Vasata was actually friends with Mr. Henry and with Mr. Vorpagel. These things are important. That background is important because you're all human. You all have friends. You all have family. You all have acquaintances. There isn't anything magical about people that become involved in the drug trade. There's nothing the state has presented that suggests to you that Mr. Vasata is a violent individual who has done anything like this before. Their only evidence is that he was friends with these individuals. Their only evidence is that they talked to him about their conflicts with Mr. Kasoukas. And their only evidence is is that he was there and was shot in the back, the same way the other victims were. You have to decide, based on those facts, whether or not you believe that Chris Vasata went there that night with the thought in the forefront of his mind that I'm going to kill somebody. I'm going to kill them. So I've been talking to them all weekend, texting with them. I've been at their house visiting with them. I've come by once a week for years. There's no evidence of that. Don't be misled by those arguments. He was there, but that doesn't make him guilty of murder. So I'm going to leave the rest of talking about the evidence to Mr. Pribble. Okay?
Thank you. So the defense still has their full time, and they've divided it amongst themselves. But what I think is a good idea is that we're going to take a very, very short 5-minute break. People use the bathroom. When you come back in, the defense will wrap up. Then the state gets last words. Then you begin your work. Okay? So turn your pads upside down. Still don't talk about the case in any way, shape, or form. A very quick 5-minute break. I'd also ask the spectators get to your seats quickly, please.